When you're ready, let's start this journey.
Welcome to BCPL Unstacked, and let's unwind with author Susan Cushman. Let's see what Susan is reading, all about her short story collection, Friends of the Library, and her writing process. Susan is represented by Magic Time Literary Publicity with Kathy Clemens Bennett. A big thank you to Kathy for helping build strong author connections with the Northwest Regional Library System. Hey, this is Sarah.
Hi, this is Susan Cushman, author calling in from Memphis, Tennessee. Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Thank you for joining us. My first question is, would you mind introducing our listeners to Friends of the Library?
Friends of the Library is a collection of 10 short stories set in libraries in 10 small towns in my home state of Mississippi. And the way it came about was my first novel, Cherry Bomb, came out in 2017. My publisher was in Mississippi, and he had grown up in one of those small towns and knew people in the libraries and the Friends of the Library groups all over parts of Mississippi. So he said, I want you to go on a little library book tour for Cherry Bomb, your novel. And my first reaction was, really? Drive all the way to all those little towns from Memphis? You know, I'd rather do the big sexy events at the bookstores and the book festivals, you know, which I did both. But he says, just do it. So when I got over pouting, I saw my schedule, and I would look up each town and read the history before I went. Even though I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and I went to school at Ole Miss in Oxford, I had never been to most of these towns. Well, I was fascinated by their history, places like Eudora and Pontotoc and West Point, and their history was fascinating. So as I drove into each town, something inspired me to write about them. And at first I thought they were going to be nonfiction, they were going to be essays. I have a real active blog, so I would immediately go home, put pictures of little Eudora and their library and some of their people, do a blog post about the history and how fun it was to be there. But instead, something in me said, what if? And of course, what if are the opening words to a fiction writer, to turning anything into fiction. What if this man who had come to the Friends of the Library meeting was really blah, 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 and this happened and this happened? What if? And I wasn't even really a fan of short stories before I did this, but I wrote these 10 short stories pretty quickly. They kind of almost wrote themselves. In fact, I have author friends who've always said things like, oh, my characters take on a life of their own. I don't know what's going to happen. I just, you know, set them loose. And I always used to roll my eyes and say, that can't be. You know, I control my characters. They're not real. And then I read these words by William Faulkner. I have to read this because this just nailed me. And here's what Faulkner says in Friends of the Library in the back. It begins with a character usually. Once he stands up on his feet and begins to move, all I can do is trot along behind him with a paper and pencil, trying to keep up long enough to put down what he says and does. And that was my experience for the first time in my life. You know, having written a memoir, a novel, and edited 3 anthologies of essays, this was the first time I ever had this experience. And it's the most fun that I've ever had writing. You know, it was super fun. And now I love short stories. You know, it's a whole new genre to me that I think I'll probably return to them again. I was thinking, there's a quote I put in the front of the book by George Saunders, and he says, when you read a short story, you come out a little more aware and a little more in love with the world around you. And so that's what they are. They're little vignettes of the larger world. You know, and I think they're kind of made a comeback as a genre because people are so busy, and rather than reading a whole novel, which is like watching a movie,
You
reading
get the
a
whole
short
story.
is like watching one episode of the TV show, you know, as far as the length goes. The narrative arc is quicker, you know. So that's how it came about, and it was published by Kohler Books in August of 2019. Of course, I've gone back to all those libraries, and that's been so much fun. And, you know, a lot of them were like, oh, did she write about me? Did she write about me? And I had to reassure all of them that it was fiction, sometimes inspired by real people. And the funniest story is in Pontotoc, Mississippi, there was this elderly man playing the piano. during the lunch. And I just adored him. And, he just played the organ at a local Methodist church. And but I imagined, what if he had been in a band with Jim Weathersley, Midnight Train to Georgia, who is a native of that little town of Pontotoc. What if he'd been in a band with them in high school? What if he had an old flame over at Ole Miss where he used to teach music? What if he got reunited with her? And so I did all of this what if and wrote somewhat of a musical history love story. So then when I was going back to speak to the Friends group, I said to the person in charge of the Friends group, I said, oh, I hope that Jim, and I can't remember his last name, I hope he'll be there because he inspired this story. And she said, oh, I'm sorry, he passed away, which broke my heart, made me really, really sad. And then she said, but we'll be sure and invite his wife. And I went, uh-oh, he's married? Oh no, we have to be sure she knows that this was fiction, that he didn't have a girl over in Oxford and blah, blah, blah. As it turned out, she didn't come to the event, but I signed a book for her. And I said, I loved your husband, but this story was really fiction.
Very much so. That's such a delightful story.
That was really fun. Yeah, these Friends groups were amazing. There were as many as 50 at one of them. And usually there were between 12 and 20 in these tiny towns. Aberdeen, Mississippi is so small. The library is only open 3 days a week and has one part-time librarian. And at least 15 people showed up for the Friends group. And I know some of it's because there's not a lot else to do in a small town.
But that's a great number for a small library.
Yeah.
As someone who markets, that's a really big size for a small library.
I agree, and a lot of these towns don't have bookstores, so they don't have author events anywhere else. So, they've gotten some really top-notch authors to come there somehow, and the people really well read. There are a lot of retired school teachers, a lot of retired college professors. So the audiences were great. And I had a ball. And I had so much fun writing the stories. And they were inspired by the people, even if they weren't exactly the people.
I have so many questions that are based right what you've already talked about. So I'm trying to decide which direction I'm going to go. First one I'm going to ask is, I appreciate the grounding of each stop at the Friends of the Library tour that includes a little brief description. And I've never been to Mississippi, so it really helped me picture what it's on my bucket list. I should go, but it made me picture each location. And I was wondering, how did you decide the order of the stories and each city? And is there, out of the locations, do you have a personal favorite destination?
I'm a real organizer and control person. And yet, when I look back at that book, I realized it was fairly random, except that I put what was probably my favorite story first. Because
I want to mine too.
to hook the readers, Francine and Odell, I thought this is going to hook the readers. And if I was a reader and I liked the first story, I would keep reading. But after that, it was not at all like the order of driving through the state, because a whole lot of it was in Northeast Mississippi, and then a little bit way down over west at Vicksburg and down to Meridian. But it wasn't anything over in the Delta, and it wasn't anything on the Gulf Coast. So as far as a favorite town, it's sort of not fair in a sense, because I did include Oxford, and that's where I went to school at Ole Miss. And it's probably my favorite town in the state. It's a literary capital of the state, and it's full of all sorts of amazing authors and literary history there. And I've been back many times. I went to school there 50 years ago, and I've been back many times to speak at Square Books, which is a wonderful bookstore there, and at their library. I've spoken at their library, and to go to workshops and conferences, first as a student for a number of years, and then as a speaker. And so I think Oxford, it's just pretty charming. So I think it may be my favorite.
I think I did catch that in the book. If I could have picked one, that might be the favorite town.
Well, there were scenes set in Oxford in more than one story. Not just the whole story that was set in Oxford, but 2 other stories had scenes set there. So you could see how I kept being pulled back there. My characters kept wanting to go there. That was what happened.
And my personal favorite stories was Odell and Francine, as well as Avery and Julia.
Yeah.
And in several of your Friends of the Library visits, Adele Covington, which we will mention next, we need to introduce is she kind of encourages new writers and writers who haven't been published to write, which being in a creative field can be very hard in some ways. You can get a lot of constructive criticism that's not always constructive.
Right.
So how did you decide to, create the positive environment for the creative atmosphere?
It was just part of the joy of writing the stories. I didn't set out to go, okay, let's have happy endings, because they all have happy endings, even though they deal with really serious issues. It may just be my nature. I've actually gotten negative and positive comments about the fact that they're kind of like Hallmark stories. Well, that's because some people love Hallmark stories and some people don't, but they do have a little feeling. Somebody said it's kind of like Touched by an Angel in Mississippi. And at first I went, oh, they're not corny, they're not cheesy. And then as soon as I said that, I thought, well, what a terrible thing to say about Hallmark or Touched by an Angel. Those are beautiful genres of writing and television. It's just
they're heartwarming. That's, I think, the heartwarming is the tie for both of them.
Yeah, but somehow as I wrote them, they just each ended up happy. I didn't decide to do that. And partly I had dealt with a lot of my own personal issues in my first novel, Cherry Bomb, and in a number of essays I've written. And even though I touched on about 8 of those issues in here, I'm almost 70 now, turning 70 next month. And I really feel like I've had a lot of healing from a lot of my personal issues. And maybe this book reflects more of a happy mindset and less of the darkness, maybe, of my earlier writing. And I'm glad that it does. And Adele, of course, is me. When I had decided to create a fictional author that goes on this book tour, and she interacts with all these people. And again, negative and positive, some of the comments on Goodreads or Amazon are like, how can she go in there and think she's a total stranger, and these people just totally tell her their problems and she fixes them? She says, that's just not realistic. And I said, well, it's fiction. It doesn't have to be realistic. And she's so much like me. I do get in people's business, and I do want to help people, and I do want to share things that have helped me, so that's why I created Adele.
Yeah, her character is she observes people really well, like kind of noticing those little things that might be hidden under the surfaces and not talked about.
Right, exactly.
And you mentioned that some of the characters were inspired by real people, while most of it's fictionalized. How did you decide what to include that was based on your experiences traveling to the Friends of the Library versus the fictional elements?
Well, I think certain people at each of those places stood out to me, like the man playing the piano, or the young librarian that Avery is based on in Oxford. He just tied right in. All 3 of my children are adopted.
Okay.
And yeah, so my 2 adopted sons, Avery is kind of a composite of them, because one has been searching for his birth mother for many years, as Avery does, in there. And one writes fantasy, as Avery was writing. So, and one was adopted through Mississippi Children's Home Society, which Avery was. So I was thinking about both of my sons, who are grown now. They're 39 and 43 now. And but they were a bit of an inspiration for the Avery character. And yet the workshop that he was at was one that I went to 7 years in a row, the Yoknapatawpha Summer Writers Workshop. I went there 7 years in a row, and I set him there in that workshop. And it was so easy to recreate what it would have been like to be there, having your manuscript critiqued, getting to know the faculty who mostly teach at Ole Miss, and which why I connected him with Julia, who kind of is a composite of a couple of my friends who are writers who teach at Ole Miss. And so it was just a really fun blend of real and fiction that just sort of wrote itself. It just sort of came together magically.
That was such a lovely story. I loved the ending of it. So I don't want to share it because I don't want to spoil, but that was such a lovely story.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm kind of backtracking and jumping forward.
All right.
I wanted you to kind of share your process in writing the sequel, John and Mary Margaret, which I believe is going to be out this June.
Exactly. Thank you. this was really another fun thing that happened. You know, when I say fun thing, you have to understand my first novel, Cherry Bomb, took about 6 or 7 years. And it has a whole lot of, you know, the hard things I've been through in my life woven throughout it. But I also had a literary agent from New York I worked with for a while, and I did not like what she was doing with the book with the editors, so I quit her. And so it slowed down that whole process. And then my memoir, Tangles and Plaques, A Mother and Daughter Face Alzheimer's, was about my mother and I and her journey with Alzheimer's. So that was a very difficult thing. And it covers 8 years of our life together. So here were these very laborious works, you know, hard works that I had done. And then along came Friends of the Library, wrote itself in 3 months, so much fun. So one of the people who read it, at least one, I think 2 or 3, but one is an author named Mandy. And she said, I think you should turn the short story about John and Mary Margaret into a novel. There's just so much there, and it could be expanded, and it could be timely because, you know, they have a mixed race relationship. So I thought, well, I'm going to do that. And this was during the pandemic. About the first 2 months of the pandemic, last March and April, I was really in a funk, like a lot of people were. I couldn't write. I barely could read. I ate junk food and watched TV for about 2 months. And then my husband, who was working from home, you know, saw this funk I was in, and he said, I don't get it. He says, you're a writer, and I can think of all the times you wished you had more quiet, alone time so you could write. Well, here it is. And I went, oh, yeah, you're right. So I started working on John and Mary Margaret, and it was right at the height of, I don't know if you can say it's the height of a lot of the protests going on about racial injustice in the country. And our son-in-law is Black, and I have mixed race granddaughters. So this is something that's really important to me to speak out about in some way. I thought, how can a 69-year-old white woman speak out about this and not come across preachy, or, you know, like they talk about the white women in the suburbs who are all into the Black Lives Matter movement. And, you know, this is close to home for me. Well, for one thing, I grew up in Mississippi. I started researching. I connected with several Black authors and got their help and input. And they were early readers to give me feedback on the language, things I should and should not say, words I should and should not use. There were red flags, you know, what things were really like. So as I wrote it, I decided that John and Mary Margaret, he's Black and she's white, and they meet their freshman year at Ole Miss, which is 1966, which was actually my husband's freshman year. I didn't get there till 69. And so, you know, they're trying to have a relationship. She's a tri-delt, I was a tri-delt. You know, there's scenes that are set in my sorority house. And of course, things don't work out for them to be dating in 1966. But as I wrote about it, I asked about 4 or 5 different sorority sisters to read the early text and give me feedback, you know, about could this have really happened at the tri-delt house? And is this the way these scenes, would you remember this? And then I have them each spending almost 50 years in Memphis, John and Mary Margaret. And so I backtracked to John's growing up as a young Black kid in Memphis, Mary Margaret growing up as a white girl in Jackson, Mississippi, where I was. So I did research on all of those eras, and again got early readers to give me feedback, because the backdrop of all of it was the civil rights movement. And so this is a genre bending book for sure, because their story is completely fictional, and yet all of the historic things that happened in the civil rights movement are true, are completely true. And so I'm blending that all through there, having a mix of fiction and fact all through there. One of my favorite things that I did was when I was living in the Belhaven neighborhood in Jackson, Mississippi, a nearby neighbor was Eudora Welty, the famous Mississippi author. And so I didn't know her, you know, I would just see her at the grocery store, but we just lived a few blocks apart. So I decided to have Mary Margaret live in her neighborhood and them become friends and get together a couple of different times in the book. And Eudora Welty not only influenced Mary Margaret's desire to be a writer, but it influenced her attitude toward race issues. You know, that was really fun because I got to pull in a favorite author and yet make this relationship fictional. Wish it had happened to me when I was a little girl, you know. So anyway, I wrote the book, again, kind of like the short stories, in about 3 months. And I went back to color Kohler books, Koehler, Kohler, because they had published Friends of the Library and had loved it. And I said, I'm giving y'all a first shot at this. And they immediately said, yes, we want to publish this. So it's coming out June. It's either the 7th or the 9th. I don't have my calendar right here. And I'm really excited about it.
I'm going to have to add it to my order read list for sure. That sounds fantastic, especially incorporating all of the civil rights movement into the historical fiction, into the fiction. And speaking of Eudora Welty and William Faulkner, both of them are mentioned throughout. How have those two authors influenced your personal writing?
Well, it's interesting. Eudora Welty has influenced it more recently than growing up. And I think it's because she wrote short stories. Mm-hmm. And again, they were not my favorite genre. You know, when I was a student at Ole Miss 50 years ago, you know, I remember writing a paper on The Sound and the Fury. I think I made up most of it because I had no idea what the book was about. And you know, I was 18 years old. But I was fascinated by his writing skill, his writing style, and his voice. You know, and right there on the Ole Miss campus, there was the Faulkner room at the library. There was Roanoke, his home. You know, my husband's senior class as a gift to Ole Miss in 69, 70. They renovated Roanoke, you know, so it was all a part of my life. It touched my life in those ways. Their writing and just their presence in my world, you know, touched my life that way. And now I've gone back and read more Eudora Welty, now that I've put her both in Friends of the Library and John and Mary Margaret. I don't know if you remember the story in Friends of the Library where the older woman that lives in the Victorian home, I at least had her be a classmate of Eudora Welty, be jealous of her, you know, and eventually write a book herself. You know, she was a recovering alcoholic who went to school with her. So, you know, it was another place to plug Welty in.
Yeah, so the Southern Gothic style that Francine was writing, I also want to read that book too. So if you want to add that to your list, it sounded great.
Of course, it's fiction. I mean,
I know.
I know, coming out about the debutante.
I like anything that's Gothic style.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there other authors that have inspired your work?
Sure. My favorite author of all time is Pat Conroy. And I was blessed to meet him in person in 2010. And he's just, the way he writes, I could never write like him, but he inspired me a whole lot in that way. And then as a person too, he has always reached out to wannabe and fledgling new authors and helped them and supported them and promoted them. And so I met him in 2010 at the Pulpwood Queens Girlfriend Weekend. This is a big international book club, and they have an annual conference every January. And I've been a speaker at it for 4 years. But in 2010, I wasn't a speaker. I went with an author friend, and he was one of the speakers. But in addition to speaking, one night at one of the meals, he was serving tables. So, you know, serving tables for all the book club members. And so he was just very humble and just adored him. And then there were also a lot of new authors who were there to speak about their books. And then after each session, people would go line up to buy their books and they were signing them. He would get in line, buy a book from one of the new authors and ask them to sign it, you know. So it wasn't just his writing, though Prince of Tides is definitely my favorite book and movie, but it was his person too. And then I've also become good friends with Cassandra King, his wife, and her book, The Sunday Wife, was an early inspiration for me. And she has contributed essays to all 3 of the anthologies I've edited and has blurbed a couple of my books and has just been really, really supportive. So both of them are, I guess, 2 of my best inspirations. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome that you're also been able to kind of develop a relationship with them as well.
Yeah.
What advice would you give new authors?
Of course, everybody says this, but read a lot and read in the genre you want to write in. You know, if you want to write short stories, read a lot of short stories. If you want to write novels, read a lot of novels. If you want to write memoir, read a lot of memoirs. If you didn't get an MFA in creative writing, if you didn't study it in school, that's fine. But do take some workshops and go to conferences. Workshops are great where your manuscripts are critiqued. Learn not only from the person leading the workshop, but the other people in there. And that helped me tremendously because I didn't do the MFA route, 50 years ago. And the good thing about MFA, which I didn't do, is it requires so much reading. So, that's a plus there. So you have to do the reading on your own if you don't go that route. But these workshops, there might be 15 or 20 people and you each have turned in 10 pages of writing and you critique each other's work. And I learned as much by seeing other people's work critiqued as by having my own critiqued, because the same principles apply, no matter what and even it gave me a respect for other genres. Like I've never been a science fiction fan. In one workshop I went to, there was a guy there who was writing science fiction. And so I thought, I don't even know how to critique this. This is so out of my wheelhouse. You have to learn about how to create a whole nother world that's believable to the reader and all of that. But when we got to the workshopping process, the leader who had done the MFA program at Ole Miss, he pointed out things in this science fiction chapter that applied to the memoir I was writing or to the essay I was writing another year, because skills in writing are skills in writing, and so I would say do that, read a lot, and then also just write every day, even if you're just writing in a journal or keeping a blog. Get in a writing group. I was in a writing group for 6 or 7 years that met monthly and critiqued each other's work, and also that encouraged each other, to keep going. So because it's a lonely world. It's not like you go check into a job from 8 to 5 and you have colleagues. You're sitting at home alone, staring at the screen or your legal pad for the people that still write by hand. So stay in touch with other writing friends a lot.
That makes sense. It creates a group to kind of encourage you to keep going and meet deadlines. Your memoir, Tangles and Plaques, A Mother and Daughter Face Alzheimer's, was developed from blog posts, and you're still an active blogger. Has maintaining a blog helped in your overall writing process?
Absolutely, because I've been blogging for about 12 years, I think. I can't remember. And for many years, I was very disciplined and wrote every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I had themes: mental health Monday, writing on Wednesday, faith on Friday. And I had been encouraged by Jocelyn Jackson, who's an author I love, at a workshop I went to, 15 years ago. And she said, start a blog, write at least 3 times a week, and don't just write about writing. Write about other things, and you'll develop readers, followers. And so, other things that are really important to me are my faith. I'm a convert to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and art, which comes out in my books, and mental health issues. So I would write about those. And sometimes I would spend a couple hours on a blog post, and the warning she said was, be careful that you don't use all your writing energy on your blog posts, because then you might not have any left for the day to actually work on your real writing, whether it's essays or books or whatever it is. And while I respected that advice, I came to realize that my blog was real writing. It was published. Lots of people read it and read it. It mattered to me. I would edit. I wouldn't just throw something up there. I'd be careful and edit. So that said, I did all of that, a whole lot, for 8 or 10 years. Once I started publishing books, I've had less time for the blog. And I probably only post once or twice a week, and I no longer follow the themes. I end up using it to review books, to promote events I'm doing, to promote other authors and what they're doing. And I use it less as a springboard for how I'm feeling about things, because I'm very confessional. I remember my husband had never looked at my blog. It had been going for a few years, and he started seeing people would make comments on social media about something on my blog, and he would go and read it, and he said, I can't believe you're writing this stuff on your blog. He says, I guess I better read it to know what's going on with my wife.
Oh.
and because I do have a confessional nature, but I also went through some really angry periods of being angry, some pretty dark periods, and it was so easy to write about that. And this may sound funny, but it's like I'm really happier now. I'm in a happier place in my life. I'm more healed. I'm less angry. So the thing is, I feel like I have less to write about on the blog. I'm not sure, where the future of it is going to go. If I'm going to find some positive things to plug in, I'm kind of in a crucible about where to go with the blog. So feel free to make suggestions.
And there is that aspect of journaling, even or blogging, being therapeutic and helpful for kind of mental health and kind of keeping yourself positive and
Yeah.
realizing that you're not alone.
Right. Well, and when I wrote those blog posts about my mother, I wrote about 60 blog posts over about an 8-year period. She was in Jackson, Mississippi. I was in Memphis, 200 miles away. And I was driving back and forth constantly for a decade from after my father died, when I, started taking over things with her, sold her house, moved her into assisted living, eventually into nursing home care. And she didn't even know who I was the last 5 years of her life. So I would go, and as soon as I would get home, I would write a blog post often about those visits. And it helped me. It was kind of a way of me reflecting and venting. And once again, it was some of my readers who said, why don't you turn this into a book? It was the easiest book. My first book that was ever published. It was published 4 years ago last week. And because it was already written, I had lived a decade of the hard part. And so I just basically did very little editing because I wanted it to keep the immediate voice of a blog post. I wrote an introduction, did very little editing, found a small faith-based press out of Texas who published it. And it was one and done, and included a bunch of pictures, too. But I've gotten lots of wonderful feedback from people. There's a group called all ALZ, like Alzheimer's, allauthors.com. And I'm part of that group. There's several hundred authors writing stories about caregiving for people with Alzheimer's. So, I'd encourage readers to go to allauthors.com, scroll through for memoirs or fiction or whatever about Alzheimer's if you want to read more.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, and of course I use that again in the novel, in my upcoming novel, John and Mary Margaret. There's a big element, a big part of the story is Alzheimer's. I'm not going to say what it is, but it's a big part of that story as well.
Many of the subjects in the short stories are hard to talk about, yet you approach these subjects with ease and grace. You have a gift in helping erase societal stigmas around such topics as alcoholism, eating disorders, and sexual abuse. What made you decide to include those moments with your characters?
Well, again, I've always been very confessional, and most of these issues are things that I have touched my life. And so one thing I've done at book readings for this is give a little one-liner about each story, and then tell you what part of that came from my life, if you would like for me to do that.
Sure.
So you start off in Eudora, where a homeless man and a recovered alcoholic woman who went to school with Eudora Welty and has an unpublished manuscript in her attic. So the homeless man, in Memphis, there's a huge homeless issue. My husband and I have reached out a lot to homeless people, have cooked meals for them, and really tried to help them. And so I wanted this homeless man to be a main character. Adele, Francine, the character Francine, is a recovered alcoholic, and I struggled with alcohol for a lot of years, and I don't anymore. And went to school with Eudora Welty. And, so all of those are the connections. In Aberdeen, a budding artist is a victim of domestic violence. That's not about me, but I do have friends who've been victims of domestic violence. In Oxford, a young man writing a dystopian fantasy novel is searching for his birth mother. And, I have all 3 of my kids are adopted. They're grown now. And one has written fantasy and one has searched for his birth mother. So those come right out of my life. In Senatobia, a mixed race couple who tried to date on the Ole Miss campus in the 1960s reunite 50 years later when they discover that their spouses, who both have Alzheimer's, are in the same nursing home. So that's a little bit of a spoiler alert also for the book, because of my dealing with my mother and her Alzheimer's. And my son-in-law is Black, and I have mixed race granddaughters. So all that's close to my heart. In South Haven, a 7-year-old girl battles a rare form of cancer at St. Jude's Children's Hospital and receives help from an Orthodox priest and a weeping icon. We live about 3 minutes from St. Jude's Hospital here in Memphis. I'm a cancer survivor. I'm Orthodox, and I have painted icons, and I have seen weeping icons. So that's all a lot from my life. In Starkville, a young mother who experienced childhood sexual abuse struggles with eating disorders. That's definitely straight from my life. Those things are both true from me. In West Point, Adele helps solve the kidnapping case of an 8-year-old girl. Okay, so this is because for 20 years, I have never missed an episode of Law and Order SVU. So that was what inspired that story, not my own personal life. In Pontotoc, a musician who played in a high school band with Jim Weatherly of Midnight Train to Georgia finds late life romance. That's all just completely fictional and fun and lighthearted. In Vicksburg, a former contestant in the Miss Mississippi pageant is glad that the swimsuit competition is being eliminated from the Miss America pageant. So I grew up as a little girl in Mississippi, just glued to the TV every time the Miss America pageant happened. And Mississippi had quite a few Miss Americas. So I was down in Vicksburg speaking actually at a bookstore rather than a library, because the Friends of the Library group was defunct at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was during the Miss Mississippi pageant, which takes place in Vicksburg. And so, there were contestants in town. I was just real aware of it all. And because I have struggled with eating disorders and body image stuff, I used to teach aerobic dancing. I always thought I was too fat. There was so much emphasis on bodies, the Barbie aspect of all of that. So that's where my personal feelings and experience come into that one. And then lastly, in Meridian, Mississippi, Adele meets a descendant from the Gypsy tribe whose king and queen are buried there in the same cemetery as Adele's grandparents. Well, my grandparents are buried in the same cemetery with the Gypsy king and queen. And I had been to Meridian to speak at the Mississippi Writers Guild conference a couple of summers ago. And one of the things they did for us just for entertainment was they offered ghost tours of downtown Meridian, because there's a lot of haunted buildings in downtown Meridian. So I went on the ghost tours, and one of the buildings they talked about is called the 3-Foot Building, and it's where my grandmother worked in the 1950s as a secretary. And I would go to work with her when I visited in the summer. So I just kind of pulled in all together things about my childhood in Meridian, my mother, and then the Gypsies, kind of rolled it all into one. It was a lot of fun. So those are the 10 stories, and which parts of them pull aspects from my own life.
Makes me want to reread everything again
to
kind of pull all the personal stories. In line with one of the stories, your earlier novel, Cherry Bomb and Friends of the Library both mention the weeping icons in the Orthodox Church. Can you tell us a little bit more about the weeping icons and your personal connection with them? And have you traveled to a lot of them?
Yes, and yes. Again, my husband and I converted from Presbyterian Protestant faith to Eastern Orthodoxy many years ago, and I studied iconography specifically at monasteries where the nuns were teaching you to paint icons. And one of the monasteries I visit is in Michigan, and that I studied iconography at. And one time when I was there, the nuns said that there was a weeping icon at a church in Detroit, and they were going to see it. Would I like to go with them? So I went with them, and it was just an unbelievable experience because, as you approach the icon in the front of the church, and there were a lot of nuns and a lot of people singing Orthodox hymns and all of that, and it's up on a stand, and it's an icon of the Mother of God, of the Virgin Mary. And there's a little container there to catch the tears that are coming out of the icon's eye and are collecting into a little container there. And if there's a priest there, he will take a little brush and anoint you, with the oil if you want to be. There have been stories of healing, people being healed from all sorts of diseases, cancer and other stuff. Mm-hmm. But it was just an awe-inspiring experience for me. So when I got back home to Memphis, I told some of my friends in my church about it, and a group of 4 of us women decided to go to Chicago. We drove to Chicago because there were 3 weeping icons at 3 different churches up there. So we made a little pilgrimage, and each one was a uniquely inspiring experience. It's interesting because my husband and I have traveled over, many places in the world and been to monasteries in Greece and places that are predominantly Orthodox countries, but I've never seen a weeping icon in any of those places. I've only seen them here in this country. And so that inspired the story, both in Cherry Bomb, the novel, and in the story in Friends of the Library about the little girl with cancer, So they're very real. And I probably painted 60 icons, taught classes for a number of years, and then I retired from all of it to write. because both are such consuming things that there's no way I could do both. Yeah, anyway, so I haven't written any icons in a decade now, but I love them, and they're all over our church, and they're called windows to heaven because basically they help. You don't worship them, and you don't worship the people in them, whether it's Christ. Well, if it's Christ, you do, but there are a lot of icons of saints, and they're icons that tell stories, like parables and things from the Bible. They help you worship, but you don't worship them. They're not idols.
It reminded me of traveling to, and I know this isn't Orthodox, it's more Catholicism, but I traveled to Siena and in Italy, and there's the rosary beads are rose scented there because it's connected to Saint Catherine, which is the craziest story for hers. But do you want me to, can I tell you because they always have crazy stories that are connected.
Sure.
So Saint Catherine of Siena, she had died in Rome, but everyone wanted a piece of the saint. So they would basically put them in reliquaries.
Right.
So the Sienese, that was her hometown. They really wanted her. So they cut off her head and they put it in a bag. And then they were leaving. And then the Roman guards saw the bag, wanted to know what was in it. So they opened the bag and it's rose petals. Everything's just rose petals. So she's like connected with that scent. So I could literally smell the scent of the rosary beads when I was reading that passage in your book. But then when they got to Siena, it turned back into her head, which is in a reliquary in one of the churches, and you can see it. And then the foot is in Venice. So the body's in Rome, foot's in Venice, and the head's in Siena.
Right. I've been to Venice, but not to Siena. And yeah, the Catholic and Orthodox have a lot of similar traditions about saints and Orthodox. Saints and icons and relics and all of that. And the rose smell, often when icons are weeping, it's a myrrh that's coming out of it, and it has a rose smell, which is referred to in my novel, and maybe in the short story. I can't remember if the icon that's weeping, all of a sudden the room smells like roses.
I think it was in the short story because I remembered that part. I could smell it.
Very mystical. Yeah, it is. And Saint Catherine of Siena is the patron saint of one of my goddaughters and a couple of my best friends. So
okay, so you already knew that story.
I did.
Okay, you did mention that many compare your short stories to like Touched by an Angel. So if Friends at the Library could become like a television show or a movie, who would you pick to play Adele Covington?
Oh gosh, I actually have not thought of that. I should have thought of that about that. It's funny, of all the interviews I've ever done and times I've spoken on it, no one has ever asked me that. So here I am stuck on, I can't imagine. She was 60, but Diane Keaton would be a good one. Yeah.
I can see that. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
I thought I might stump you on that one.
Yeah, I wish I had some warning. I could have really thought through some people. Anyway.
I tried to look up some that might, like Diane Lane was another one that I was like, well, maybe, or Andie MacDowell. She would be good. I know she's in some Hallmarks.
Yeah, maybe so.
But yes, Diane Keaton, I can totally picture as Adele. And there were a few late in life romances in the book, including Robert Earl and Betsy, as well as Mary Margaret and John. What inspired that sweet thread?
Golly, I'm not sure I know. I do have 2 or 3 friends who have married later, having lost husbands earlier. One I'm thinking of in particular, married in her 70s and had a wonderful late life romance. But I don't know that they were in the forefront of my mind or if it's just something that unfolded with the story. I knew that John and Mary Margaret were going to have to get back together, the couple at Ole Miss. So, that was the premise of the story to start with. And that's not really a spoiler alert. The readers got to know that that's going to happen, and they're going to overcome a lot of racial prejudice in order to do that. And times are going to change a lot, over 50 years. I don't know. It's just part of the story that unfolded.
Since we're a library podcast, how have libraries made an impact on your life?
Well, of course, everybody starts with their childhood, because when I was a little girl, I don't remember going to bookstores much. And I'm not sure why, but it's financial reasons, or maybe they weren't as prominent. But everybody went to libraries, and you could only check out a certain number of books. And if you read them before the 2 weeks was up, you'd beg your mom to take you back again, to get, I can't remember if it was 14 or 12 books, whatever it was. So those are early childhood. And then when I got to about junior high school, there was a branch library right across the street from my junior high school. And so that was really wonderful, because I walked home from school anyway, then I could just pop in there. I especially remember studying for final exams in there, because we'd have an exam and we'd have 2 or 3 hours. You could go home and come back for your next one, and I would just go to the library, even though it was a small branch. Those are memories from childhood. But from more recently here in Memphis, 10 years ago or so, we built a new, they call it an information center. It's a fabulous new library. And up on the 3rd floor, there's just floor to ceiling glass everywhere, and it looks out over the treetops, and it's just beautiful. And I spent a lot of time just up there writing as a quiet place, but also researching art, because I do use the internet for a lot of research. But if I'm going to research art, I want to go and find large format books on, whether it's on abstract expressionism, which I had to research for my novel Cherry Bomb, also for that same novel, researching graffiti. Both of those, now I've taken pictures of graffiti in cities all over the place because I'm fascinated by it. For research in art, especially, and other things too. And just the fact that you can go in and mention just one concept, one thread that maybe you're thinking about following it, and you can mention it to a librarian and they'll go, have you thought about blah, blah? You don't get that on the internet, at all. So, that's, as an adult, I think that's been the wonderful thing. And then the Friends of the Library groups are just awesome. I mean, I do know they started in this country. Guess where the first one was?
Where?
In France in 1913 or so.
Okay.
And then in this country in New York, and I can't remember the dates, and then they gradually grew and grew. Well, of course, they started in France because salons were so popular. And salons in Paris, people of means would bring in artists and writers and creative people, or politicians, and they would have a chance to talk about things. And so that's probably why Friends of the Library started there, But Friends of the Library groups are great. Some of them have as their main purpose to raise money for the libraries, but some of them also do author events and do things for the community. So they're wonderful.
We greatly appreciate our Friends of the Library. They
Good.
do a lot both with fundraising and author programming.
Oh, great. Good.
So what is your favorite book or books that you have read recently?
Ooh, just last week I finished a fabulous new book. It's called The Fortunate Ones. The author is Ed Tarkington, and he is from Memphis. And he has been compared to Pat Conroy in his writing style. And the book has been compared to The Great Gatsby, only modern day Great Gatsby, because it takes place in Nashville, and there's a rich kid from a private school, and then there's the kid from the projects who gets a scholarship to the school, and the way their lives interact. And it was just fabulous, The Fortunate Ones. And then completely different era, I read The Chanel Sisters by Judith Little, and it's about Coco Chanel and her sister Antoinette. And it takes place mostly in Paris. So it's historical fiction. World War II is involved. And I absolutely love that. So those were my first 2 reads of 2021. And I read a mix of fiction, memoir, self-help, spiritual, just really all over the place. I'm reading a lot last year and this year of Black authors, and reading about history of race relations. And probably the most significant book that has changed and touched my life in years is Caste, C-A-S-T-E, by Isabel Wilkerson, the Pulitzer Prize winner. And it is a masterclass in race, the history of race in America and India and Germany. So it's pretty amazing. So some heavy stuff, some really great fiction, kind of bounce around back and forth between them.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. And I think those are my main questions I had for you. Do you have anything else that you would like to share with our readers or listeners?
Um, I don't know if your library's even been open during the pandemic, but just people, please support the libraries. And if yours is just only open for picking books up or make a donation, or, please celebrate and contribute and support them, especially during this time. And remember that they're there when you're home alone. They may not deliver, but most of them, a lot of them are doing curbside. I don't know what y'all's are doing. Are you even open part-time?
We've reopened. Our main branch is still doing curbside as well for those who don't feel comfortable.
Mhm.
But we have limitations. So you can only be on the computer for a certain amount of time. And we're trying just to encourage social distancing and safe browsing, but we are open.
Yeah, great. So that would be my words. It's just, y'all remember what an amazing resource this is, and for authors and will-be authors and readers and children. And I'm always sending books to my granddaughters. And so just start young, keep reading, brings joy and richness to your life.
Thank you so much, Susan, for joining us at BCPL Unstacked. Copies of Friends of the Library will be available in the library collection for listeners who are looking for their next read. Susan Cushman's titles can also be purchased through your favorite bookstore or online vendors. Also, check out our website, www.susancushman.com. Stay safe and read, my friend. It's good for you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. Bye.